In the last 2 months, we've seen two prominent Hollywood films about religion. Conclave, featuring Ray Fiennes, John Lithgow, and Stanley Tucci, and Heretic, starring Hugh Grant and two newcomers, Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East. Both are unusual in that they take religion seriously, and I think they can be read as affirming spiritual reality and a kind of cinematic nail in the coffin of new atheism. I brought on two friends, McKay Coppins and Bill Turnbull, to talk about these movies today. There will be some spoilers, and you should know that Heretic in particular has some disturbing content and is definitely not for everyone. So, friends, welcome. Thanks for joining me on this movie conversation. What do you guys think about these movies being against new atheism as a central goal?
You know, I think that Heretic in particular could be read as like a dark satire of new atheism. Should we just kind of walk through what the movie is for those who don't want to see it or don't have the stomach for it? Yeah. It basically just briefly it follows two young sister missionaries, LDS sister missionaries, Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton, who show up on the doorstep of a man named Mr. Reed, who has apparently expressed some interest in learning about the church, has ordered a pamphlet or something like that. Mr. Reed is played by Hugh Grant. He invites them into his home, and then gradually over the course of the next, 20, 30 minutes as they're sitting in his living room, he kind of transforms from innocent, kind of curious investigator into a sinister, monologuing atheist who wants to convince these sister missionaries that their faith is founded on false premises and that actually all world religions are false. And much of the first kind of hour of the movie is dedicated to the villain of the movie kind of delivering this stem-winding lecture against organized religion. And we can dig into kind of his ideas, like what his core arguments are. But the funny thing watching it is that you really do get a sense that this guy is modeled after like 100 militant atheists that you've been like cornered at parties, like found yourself unable to escape conversations from, like, and Hugh Grant, I should say up front, like really makes the most of it. Like he has this like creepy cool professor vibe going, and he's invoking like Lana Del Rey and Radiohead, and he has like board games that he's using to illustrate his points, and it's all pretty fun to watch. But at its core, his philosophy is like a regurgitation of the kind of Richard Dawkins new atheism that we've been hearing for the last couple of decades. And I should say from there, it gets much more violent and graphic. He ends up torturing these women and they have to try to escape. But I do think that the strongest point in the movie is it's sort of like dead on characterization of a certain kind of character that you would find either in real life cornering you at a party or even more often lurking around Reddit, starting these kind of really obnoxious fights with people about religion. I don't know. What did you guys think?
He's a much more charming version of probably those guys.
Yes, that's
fair. You had a kind of really interesting experience on your mission you wrote a piece on this in the Atlantic, and that caught our attention and said we should bring McKay into this conversation. Tell us about that experience.
Yeah, it's funny. I started the piece with this long story from my mission that I thought my editors would cut, but they actually were like, "This is super interesting." Basically, I served my mission in Dallas, Texas, and there was this guy named Andrew who had a British accent who would call missionaries in our mission. And we nobody knew who he was or how he had gotten all of our phone numbers. But it became this he was like a figure of lore in our mission. He would call us and pretend to be kind of like friendly and interested in our work and lives at first, and then gradually start to interrogate our beliefs. And it was weird because, I was serving a mission in the Bible Belt. And so on some level, I like empathized with the evangelicals and Baptists who we would encounter who were trying to save our souls from hell and would try to convert us, to their denominations. But the strange thing about this guy, Andrew, is that he didn't really seem like he was trying to convert us to anything. He was just trying to get us to admit that we were wrong and he was right. And there was this like gleeful quality to it that I just could not stop thinking about when I was watching this movie.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm sometimes interrogated by post-Mormons with the same sort of gleeful energy, but they're not offering me something better. They're just like trying to liberate me from my. He's an interesting character. I think. Don't you think? By the way, Hugh Grant, I thought was the perfect choice for this movie. He makes a great Satan. He's you can clearly see like from our perspective how he might be playing the role of Satan in this sort of temple movie that we've got. There's some really interesting parallels between the temple. This is like, in some ways, the temple stood on its head, right? You enter this space, and in this case, they knock on his door because they're supposed to. He supposedly has asked them to come, and it's a very broody, dark, stormy night. They come in and quickly find that this is an environment that he's carefully crafted and created thoughtfully to provide this experience, this descent experience for these two missionaries. Did that immediately occur to you that it's like you come into a waiting room almost, you're waiting there, then you sort of invited into another room, which is this kind of weird church that he's created that's supposed to represent all religions, and that it's in that church where he deconstructs, he lays out his argument, right? But he does it in such a charming, he's so charming, creepily charming that, it occurred to me, if we ever remake the Temple movie, Hugh Grant.
There are readings of this movie out there, and you can find some good articles about it that actually argue that the filmmakers were deliberately kind of creating an inverted temple situation in the film, because the sister missionaries end up, like you said, move from one room to the next, and then rather than ascending up to heaven, they essentially descend down to a metaphorical hell. They go into a basement and then another sub-basement, and at each level there are more and more revelations about what's going on here. And in this sub-basement there's kind of this climactic scene where they are kind of, or the one sister missionary who's surviving at this point is treated to the final argument that Mr. Reed is making, which is that the one true religion is control. And she finds that he's holding multiple women captive in his basement in dog cages, and he is using this as a stand-in for organized religion. So I will admit that the inverted temple symbolism did not come to me when I was watching the film the first time. I thought it was a really interesting reading. I'm still skeptical that the filmmakers actually intended that, although once you see it, it's kind of hard to unsee. That said, I guess I didn't give the filmmakers that much credit for having that much to say about Mormonism. It's possible. I kept thinking about Dante's Inferno and the circles of hell. That was kind of the symbolism that stuck out to me. And in fact, I think at one point the camera lingers on a diagram of the circles of hell that's hanging on the wall.
That's right. And that's in that bottom area where the women are kept captive. It's kept freezing, which is the same as in Dante's vision.
But I'm curious if you felt like the movie, what the movie thought of Mr. Reed's ideas. Because just briefly to recap them, like his basic contention is that all the major world religions are effectively just reorientations of more ancient traditions and mythologies. And, there's this one point at which he takes the sisters through all the kind of ancient gods, Egyptian gods, Persian gods, etc., who have similar stories to Jesus, at least in his telling, that they were born on the 25th of December to virgin mothers, and they performed miracles and died and were resurrected. I will say that even in recapping his argument in The Atlantic, I got a couple persnickety emails from readers who were like, this is not actually an accurate description of the Egyptian god Horus. And I was like, look, take it up with Mr. Reed. But
Well,
like,
I mean, and they were thin caricatures of these religions that left out a lot. And
totally.
It was really fun that one of the Sister Barnes actually pointed that out. Like, yeah, you've laid out this argument, sounds very reasonable, but have you noticed this? I mean, so she points out just how thin
she challenges
his understanding of this religions are, and she really pushed back. Yeah,
she challenges him. Then her character dies a few minutes later in the movie, and we don't get to see her challenge him anymore. But here's my question: is like, when I was watching the film, it's clear that Mr. Reed is the villain. He's the bad guy. You're rooting against him. You're rooting for the sisters. But my sense was that the film seemed to think that this monologue he was delivering was provocative and sophisticated and maybe even profound, and that while his motives were clearly bad, and that he's kind of a perverse, twisted manifestation of the worst of this ideology, I felt like the movie took his ideas pretty seriously, and I'm open to other interpretations, because other people I've talked to say the movie disagree. Like, what did you think the filmmakers thought of his ideas?
I think it may be that the filmmakers started with from that. Probably that was their background, and they seem clearly to have read Dawkins or whoever. I believe I've heard that they did.
They did, yeah.
Immerse themselves in that. And I've read Dawkins. You've read Dawkins. I think they started from there, but I think the movie my guess is, and it'd be fun to have the filmmakers here, but my guess is that during the movie itself, they began to test the limits of where that can lead, and maybe probe deeply where that kind of philosophy can lead. And it showed that it was quite thin as well, right? I also think one theme in the movie that was really interesting was he had this little scale model of his entire house, right? It was and he manipulated this model. He at one time said, "We're living in a simulation." Now, this is a theme, and so he'd actually constructed this little simulation, this little scale model of his house and what was going to happen. And so he took the idea of simulation. I think the movie takes this idea of exploring what a simulation could be seriously. I think it explores. So you've got people like Elon Musk who has famously said that there's a real high chance that we are living in a simulation. Mm-hmm. In which case, it's kind of all a game. It's a controlled game, and so. At the end of this, if it's all about control, where does control go ultimately?
Yeah.
Which is, I think, just a fascinating topic for our time.
I just have to say though, and again, is in terms of characterization of of Mr. Reed, it's like kind of pitch perfect that he's a devotee of simulation theory, because again, I think that idea has kind of come into vogue in the last 5-10 years among people who would formerly have thought of themselves as kind of Dawkinsites, It's a good point. I guess to me, and Zach said at the beginning of this that these are two films, Conclave and Heretic, that take religion seriously, and I think that that's true up to a point. They take religion certainly much more seriously than movies like this made 15 years ago would have been. So in terms of thinking of them as nails in the coffin of new atheism, I think that's probably a fair reading. At the same time, I still found a certain level of kind of condescension about religion that was not, I don't think, intended, but it was more subtle that was there. And to me, especially in Heretic, you saw it in one of the final scenes when Sister Paxton, I believe, is the one who's still alive, when she's been stabbed by Mr. Reed and she's stabbed him, so they're both kind of laying on the floor dying. And she delivers this very eloquent, kind of, I would argue uncharacteristically eloquent monologue about a 1998 Templeton Foundation study that found that intercessory prayer doesn't work, that there's no connection between praying for somebody who's sick and the medical outcomes of the person being prayed for. And where she kind of ends up is, I think it's beautiful that we pray for people even though we know that it probably doesn't work. It's just nice to think about somebody other than yourself. And I think that a typical person watching this movie, especially like a non-Latter-day Saint and maybe non-religious, would see that as like a pro-religion scene. Like that monologue was like illustrating that like these, this movie thinks that religion has its place and is worthwhile even if it's kind of bunk, right? And I guess to me, it felt like a cop-out. And first of all, it felt a little unrealistic. I don't think that actually most devout missionaries think of prayer that way. That's not to say they don't have doubts. I think we've all had, wrestled with doubts. But I think that most people of faith don't think about prayer in terms of, would a Templeton Foundation study find that this works? Like we pray because we have developed this mysterious relationship with our Father in heaven. It transcends empiricism. It transcends, what studies and scholars could find. And that's the beauty in it, right? And I feel like the movie doesn't quite capture that, at least for me.
Mm-hmm. Well, she did pray. I thought it was really interesting that she had, and you're faced in this movie, these two protagonists, these two sister missionaries. Maybe we should talk a little bit more about them and like who they were and what they represented within the Latter-day Saint experience. But at the end, she actually did have enough faith to pray. And you may remember that as a result of that prayer, despite the fact she prayed despite the fact that she had very good reason not to believe in prayer, right? So in the face of good reason not to believe or exercise faith, she did those exact things. Mm. And there was some immediate effect to that prayer, actually. So she makes the case against prayer, and then her prayer is almost immediately answered.
Well, in the form of the other sister missionary who we've believed is dead for the last hour of the movie rises as if from the dead and kills Mr. Reed before he can kill her companion, and then immediately dies again.
And immediately dies, yeah. So I think it actually, I think it portrayed how having faith in the face of complete despair, and for all kinds of reasons not to exercise faith. Despite that, they did exercise faith, and they buoyed each other up at different times too.
Yeah.
Sister Barnes. So these were two really interesting characters. Zach, do you remember when they sort of introduced themselves? When they were introducing themselves to Mr. Reed, and the first couple of scenes were sort of laying out certain things about these two sisters, right? What do you remember about that?
Yeah, Sister Barnes is cool. I think her parents are a convert, so she is not a cultural Mormon from the Mountain West Core. She has a hipper background and perspective.
Diving a little deeper in that, her father had died sort of painfully. Her mother then sort of converted to Mormonism back east. They'd eventually found their way to Salt Lake City. And you just get a sense from Sister Barnes that her life has been very complicated, and she's actually, and this is another spoiler alert, but we find later in the movie that she has a contraceptive implant. So she's been, clearly probably sexually active in the past at least, and they have a very awkward. The first scene in the movie kind of sets the tone for. Well, I think. It's a very awkward scene, actually, one I wish I hadn't done. But I think they're talking about the very first scene in the movie. They're talking about condom sizes, right? Which I don't know.
Probably the most unrealistic. Unrealistic part of the movie.
I read one review in Variety where the critic said it reeks of a provocative opening page of a spec script that you put in to try to get the attention of studios, and argued that they probably should have taken it out because once the viewer is in the seat and bought the ticket, they don't need that scene. Yeah, I thought that was pretty a groaner of an opening scene. But
that was a groaner. That was a groaner.
But I think you're right though that after that scene, the two characters are actually pretty well drawn, the two sister missionaries, and they're sympathetic, but they're different, and they're textured. And I think to Zach's point about kind of how this film takes religion seriously, like, I have not seen many portrayals of Latter-day Saint characters, certainly not missionaries, as kind of sympathetic and complicated as those two characters are. So I do give the movie credit for that.
Sister Paxton grew up in a huge Mormon family in Ogden. By all appearances, from the setup, she was, a stereotypical Mormon girl, and probably the subject of, what you would expect a patriarchal religion like people perceive Mormonism to produce. Someone that would produce a Sister Paxton, and yet she surprises you. She needs some encouragement from Sister Barnes throughout the movie, because Sister Barnes is the one that initially challenges, both intellectually and in every other way, pushes back against this villain. But then that helps this Sister Paxton discover reserves that she probably didn't know she had, and that we were surprised by, right? Yeah, including all of the things that she was honest about, her doubts. Yeah, so it was, I think these were very textured characters and strong, resourceful, bright women. They were the heroes. There's no question about who is the hero of the movie. If you wanted to make a case for atheism, this was not the way to do it, because there's nothing compelling.
I think that's right, but I want to go back to the question of, was Mr. Reed's lecture on religion meant to be persuasive? And I think the filmmakers dedicated a lot of energy to maintaining ambiguity about what is true. I think that's like key to the message of the film, is that faith is a choice between certainty and doubt. Ultimately, it comes down to a personal choice. Although I think there's a few things that tip the scale of the movie towards faith. And so I think the arguments are meant to be, there's like interesting parallels in all these different myths. Wonder if mine's a myth. At the same time, there's a few signs that Christian teaching in particular is different and special. So for example, I think it's Sister Barnes, when they go down and see the women trapped in cages, like literally gives the coat off her back, like follows Jesus's commandment directly, and it shows compassion. And then the miracle and the conclusion, I think, are meant to be carefully crafted to be interpreted either way. Does Sister Paxton escape miraculously, and God and the Spirit are real? Or is it all in her head? And none of this is true. I think everything they did is trying to balance the possibilities of both for any reasonable viewer.
Yeah, I think I just wish that Mr. Reed's lecture had been more interesting. Like, I think that probably a lot of listeners here, and certainly those of us on this having this conversation, are pretty familiar with this idea of like all these mythologies are just like, copies of old mythologies. Like, and it's kind of been pretty widely debunked by like serious scholars of religion and historians. Like, I actually, in the piece that I wrote, I quote from a couple writers who have written about this. One of them is Matt Bowman, who's a religion historian at Claremont Graduate University, and he wrote in the Tribune kind of about how he started to slump in his seat once Mr. Reed made these arguments, because he was like, okay, I've heard this one before, and it's been pretty widely debunked. Lane Welch, writing in Wayfair, had a great line. I just want to read it, actually. Lane wrote, I found myself checking out a bit. How many times have I heard this neo-Campbellian spiel that distorts Asian religions from the comfort of an armchair, reducing ancient systems of belief to the level of 20th century entertainment franchises? And I thought that was like very well
the kind of brilliance you'd only find in Wayfair, right?
Absolutely. We all endorse Wayfair here. No, but I think that there are, I am self-aware enough to know that there are compelling arguments against organized religion. I've heard them, I've encountered them. I don't have answers for every argument, every atheist argument. I just found Mr. Reed's particular argument to be a little stale and superficial, and I think that the filmmakers thought it was more profound than it was. But I do think you're right, Zach, that like the movie is deliberately ambiguous about who's right and what's going on. And to your point about this kind of faith being a choice between certainty and doubt, in the end, Mr. Reed's fatal defect is his certainty, right? He's the one voicing the atheistic arguments, but he's far more certain about what he believes than the sister missionaries are. And the missionaries clearly have faith, right? They believe in what they're teaching, but in some ways he ends up being a stand-in for the kind of most dangerous version of religious conviction you can have. And to again go back to your idea, like that's why I think that in a deeper way this movie is an indictment of new atheism, because the fatal flaw of new atheism is its absolute certainty in its own rightness and in its own righteousness. And I think that a lot of certainly Western culture and American culture has kind of moved past that in the last few years.
Well, it's also, you could say the fatal flaw of atheism is that it is entirely a rational enterprise, right? Mm-hmm. And his argument was entirely irrational, seemed completely unaware that there might be people that know things in other ways than through reasoned argument. It was Sister Barnes who pointed that out. It's like, you're missing an entire spectrum here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's an experience that I have often when speaking to atheists or skeptics. Like, you think that's the only way of knowing, and if that is the only way that you know, it always leads to darkness. Whether that's in service of belief or disbelief. Yep. It always leads to disconnection in some way. It's like you're disconnected from a part of yourself. If reason is your only way of knowing, if you've been thrown that to the exclusion of all other things. So I think that was also an actual. I really feel like the movie makers were trying to make that point.
So guys, does she survive? Does she actually escape the house, or is that yes. that a post death vision of heaven?
I feel like there's been a trend in movie criticism in the last couple of years where everybody tries to find some element of a movie, is often the climactic moment, and argue that it's actually a dream, right? Or a death vision or whatever. We saw this with Top Gun Maverick. With Tar. I tend to take that closing scene somewhat literally. I think she did escape the house. But there's a moment in that after she's escaped the house where, and this is kind of, a moment that a lot of people have debated, where a butterfly comes and lands on her finger. And it's a callback to a moment earlier in the film where Sister Paxton says that if she were reincarnated, again, how many sister missionaries do you know who are musing about their own reincarnation? I don't know. But anyway, she says she would want to come back as a butterfly, and she would want to land on her friend's fingers. And so in that final moment of the movie, she has escaped the house. We are taken to believe that Mr. Reed is dead. She kind of collapses on the ground, and a butterfly comes improbably. It's a wintry day, and lands on her finger. And you can read that as a sign from God. You can read that as her companion who has died being reincarnated and coming and landing on her finger. You can read it as a pure coincidence. I actually got a copy of the screenplay, and the way it kind of describes that final moment is running through the various scenarios, and then it ends with it could be a sign from God, it could be a coincidence. Who knows, right? And so it kind of gets directly at this ambiguity that the film is very dedicated to.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, fun fact, I don't know if you noticed this, but when they enter into the room, that kind of faux church that he's created, what was playing on the stereo? It was a song called
The Air That I Breathe? Is it that song? Or?
That was in there too, but the first song was called Just Like a Butterfly That's Caught in the Rain.
Ah, good catch. Well done.
Yeah. Thanks.
Well, what did you think, Zach? Give us your take. Did she survive, or was it a death dream?
I mean, I think you're right. I think they crafted it so that you can
don't know.
decide.
Yeah.
And it's meant to spur internet comments that drive ticket sales.
There has been an enormous amount of discourse about this movie, I should say. And our people, Latter-day Saints, have contributed to a lot of it. But I actually, I have enjoyed the discourse for the most part. And it's almost like a relief to have a conversation about a movie or a piece of pop culture that treats Mormonism that is not just about representation. There has been a lot of conversation about representation, and I get it. I get why it happens, and I think it's fair. The screenwriters, the filmmakers are not Latter-day Saints. The actresses did grow up in the church, and I think that's part of why the characters they play feel a little bit more layered or textured than you would expect. But I kind of like that a lot of the conversation has been able to push past representation questions and have a more kind of interesting conversation about faith and certainty and doubt and the ideas of these kind of new atheists and all of that. I don't know. I've enjoyed it. I don't know how you two feel about it.
Yeah, I thought it was a really well-made movie, by the way. And there's a lot... It's a movie that you could actually, if you had the stomach for it, you could watch a couple of times to just explore a lot of there's a lot of rich symbolism, a lot of little things that are going to go unnoticed by a lot of moviegoers that probably deserve,
How do you feel about, the church has obviously expressed concern about the safety of its missionaries and what this would, do to the safety of missionaries. And I think that it is totally fair for the institutional church to respond primarily that way, to basically be like, we're not in the movie criticism business, but what we are in is in the kind of missionary protection business, and anything that kind of portrays this level of violence that could inspire, somebody to try something similar is bad. I also think the film's marketing campaign has been kind of excessively glib. They put up these kind of fake missing posters for the two sister missionaries depicted in the film in the Salt Lake City airport, where a lot of real life missionaries are flying in and out of every day. And so,
this is clearly an advertising agency that doesn't know the fear of being a parent with your children out there on their own in a foreign country.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess I tend to think that I guess I hope that there won't actually be any direct result of this movie in terms of threats to missionaries, but you never know. And so I do understand the church's concern there.
And also, if you had a daughter out there, I would want to make sure she had some mace in her purse and something to protect her from bad actors out there. This might be an actual little bit of a wake-up call for some parents and some missionaries to take some precautions, because certainly in this movie at the end, you were clear on who the heroes were, and you're clear on who the villains are, and in that alone, I suppose it's a pro-religion, pro-faith movie. So would you recommend it? Like, what did you rate it? Thumbs up, thumbs down?
Oh man, I have a hard time recommending it to most of my Latter-day Saint friends just because of how violent it is. And I'm not a horror movie person. I don't really watch these movies, and so I found the graphic violence, especially in the third act, to be very disturbing. And I've been told by people who do watch more of these movies that it's not especially bad compared to...
I think this is a very mild slasher movie, right?
Yes,
like it's,
yeah.
Like I'm not a horror movie guy either. And it's clearly it's in the horror genre, and I'm not too qualified to opine on this, but this seems much more philosophical and thoughtful than you would expect from a horror movie. So it's like, we're going to make this in this horror movie genre, but we're going to really explore some things here. Do you think it was trivializing? I think McKay, you've written in the past, particularly in the wake of the Book of Mormon musical, and pushed back against the trivialization of religion in general, and specifically our faith. And I thought, How does this...
I mean, you know, I didn't think that this movie had enough to say about Mormonism specifically to be trivializing to our faith. I just felt like Mormonism was almost kind of a stand-in for all religion in this movie. And this is where I come back to my argument, my read, which was that the movie just had too much interest in the kind of Reddit level ideas of the villain. I felt like the ideas were not interesting enough or compelling enough to merit, you know, the amount of time that it dedicated to his kind of monologue. I don't think it trivializes faith, though, in the sense that I don't think the movie comes down on the side of the atheist, right? Like, I don't think it comes down on the side of religion is bad, yeah. Right? It clearly doesn't. I did, you know, just going back to that monologue that the Sister Paxton gives as she thinks she's dying, I did kind of feel like there was a subtle condescension there about religious faith that, and you get this a lot in pop cultural treatments of faith, not just Mormonism, this kind of like idea that we're going to show, as the secular filmmakers, show magnanimity to the people of faith with sort of a like pat on the head and like, you know, it's clearly not true, but it can still make you a good person, so that's fine. That idea is in the Book of Mormon musical very explicitly. I think it's here too, to a certain extent. It's you know, more complicated because I think the film, it doesn't fully come down on any one side. But you see this in all kinds of depictions of religious faith, that where filmmakers think that they're being generous to people of faith, they are often sort of patronizing them a little bit. But I don't think that it's nearly as grotesque as like something like Under the Banner of Heaven, which treated Mormonism, and we talked about it on this show actually, as a, you know, dangerous, insidious threat to American life. I don't think it's as glib or kind of silly as The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives and the Housewives franchise, which kind of takes these like microscopic subcultures that have very little to do with Mormonism at large and tries to draw sweeping conclusions about them. I think it's much more nuanced than that. I still think that I would like for the next phase of filmmaking about religion to finally drop the like default condescension, but I think that probably won't happen until actual people of faith, regardless of what faith they're coming from, are the ones making these movies, and I don't think we're there yet. I do think that there are some interesting parallels in Conclave in terms of like how they treat faith, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Let's move to Conclave, but I have a slightly different take that builds on yours, McKay. So I think you're right that secular filmmakers do this thing where they're like, haha, religion, it's all fake and not real, but you know, it helps you be a good person. That's sweet. But I think surprisingly, and probably against their own intentions, they end up making a more profound defense of religion than they want to. And I noticed this first in the Book of Mormon musical, which I only saw myself like 2 or 3 years ago for the first time. And I went in expecting like a much heavier criticism of religion and Mormonism. And by the end, it's like, well, wait, so the teachings of the church transform all the lives of the village for the better. Everyone is like thriving and happy and treating each other with love. And you're saying like, this is silly. It's just, you know, so I think it punctures through. And then even in here in Heretic, yeah, the Templeton prayer monologue is silly. It sort of strikes a discordant tone, but the deeper messages that the film is showing through the actions, again, the compassion towards the trapped women, the faith that the two sister missionaries have in each other, giving their own lives for one another. I mean, Sister Barnes comes back. It doesn't try to escape herself. She saves her companion.
Right.
And I think there's these deeper transformative lessons about love that flows from something much greater and beyond us that the filmmakers themselves like may not even be trying to make, but I think it's there.
I love that take because it's a more optimistic take, and I think you're right. You can almost feel like the like secular filmmakers like struggling to grapple with the fruits of religion, right? And like, what is it about these teachings that so clearly are irrational and not grounded in anything real, and yet it makes the believers do kind things and genuinely compassionate things that are against their human nature. Like what is it about Christianity that turns these people into something better than they would be otherwise? And like, and then they kind of come around to like, yeah, I don't really know, like big shrug, right? But like, I like the idea that like they are at least willing to grapple with that. And even if they come down on the side of like, well, that doesn't mean it's true, at least they're acknowledging the goodness that flows from this belief system, right?
Well, let's move to Conclave. Conclave is a film about cardinals gathering in the Vatican to vote on the new pope after the current pope recently died. And it's a fascinating film, very well done. I really enjoyed it. Beautifully shot, extremely well acted, a lot to commend to it. And I think there's some really interesting parallels in themes and ideas in Conclave as there is in Heretic. So let's see, to finish the summary of the film, you have a deacon, Dean Lawrence, who is in charge of managing this chaotic process. And there, as you can expect, are factions who are trying to win the election by gathering their supporters. And the factions end up separating mostly by ethnicity or by political ideas. So you have conservative factions, you have liberal factions, you have African, Italian, American. And each of these factions is vying for supremacy, and there's many scandals that happen. Some people rise, some people fall. But the film ends in a quite unexpected way, which is that a cardinal that no one had ever heard of, that was created, quote, in pectore, arrives and manages to be selected the Pope. And
explain in pectore. Sorry, not.
I looked it up. In pectore, it's in the heart of the Pope, basically. Like the Pope has made this person a cardinal, not officially, like there's no paper trail or whatever, but has informed them. And actually, in some cases, this has happened in real life. In some cases, the Pope doesn't even tell them until years later that they've made them a cardinal in pectore, but has basically decided this person is a cardinal now. And none of the other cardinals in the movie knew about this person becoming a cardinal. His mission was in Kabul, right? He's like he's the Archbishop of Kabul, and because of his dangerous assignment, his position has not been announced, basically.
That's right. And for a while in the movie, this unusual cardinal is only gathering a few votes, but he could have stays in the game.
He has he has no aspirations at all. He's kind of doesn't even know why he's there.
He's like quiet and humble, sort of lurking on the sidelines, right?
Yeah. And meanwhile, the more powerful candidates, turns out they were scheming and doing machinations and get discredited and disgraced. And at the end, you think that Dean Lawrence might become the new pope. It looks like, a pretty good guy is going to become pope. And then there's a car bomb that blasts open one of the windows in the Sistine Chapel.
Yeah, they convene this conclave in the Sistine Chapel. Virtually the whole movie takes place either in the Sistine Chapel or in the lodgings in the I can't remember the other building, but
that's right.
It takes place there in the Vatican.
And so this window crashes, people kind of fall down, a burst of light flows through.
Well, there's clarity. They call it so I just remember the window had been missing because of this. There'd been these terrorist acts. That's a little bit of an odd aspect of the movie, actually, but it symbolizes something. We don't need to probably explore that, but it ends up having the effect of blowing out one of the windows in the Sistine Chapel. And in the last scene, there is this kind of rustling of wind, which reminds one of the day of Pentecost from the New Testament. And they've all been immersed in this sort of struggle, who to vote for, and these arguments for and against. And they all come to silence and hear this kind of rustling of wind. And there's this moment of silence, and then they all put pen to paper for their final. I don't know how many votes there were, but there were, I don't know, 8 or 10 votes, and they hadn't been able to come to a conclusion. And of course, this is the way that the Holy Spirit actually, in spite of all of these machinations and backroom deal making, which inevitably I think is part of processes like this. When the direction of the church is at stake, God finds a way to cut through that, and so I think ultimately I think the message there is that despite all of our humanness, God can find a way to work and direct the Catholic Church. So
that's right, that even within an institution where there's all kinds of human influences and human conversations, God found a way to intervene and to help the institution continue on its divine path. The surprising reveal is that this unusual cardinal, the Cardinal of Archbishop of Kabul, who was originally Mexican, turns out to have been born intersex, and so contains a uterus and ovaries, and that raises some interesting questions about gender and patriarchy and miracles, which are, again, themes in Heretic. So maybe I can ask you two, what do you make of the meaning of the cardinal's gender ambiguity? Why is that important to the film's message?
I would imagine that there were a lot of people that responded negatively to that, saying, "Oh, this is another heavy-handed interjection of the agenda for sexual and gender minorities," right? But I think you're asking, is there an actual deeper meaning here? Okay.
Well, I think it really relates to this theme of certainty and faith and doubt, which runs through Heretic as well. And before I answer, I want to go back to an early moment in the film when Dean Lawrence, that's his name, right? Who's presiding over, he's presiding over the conclave, and he gives this kind of impromptu speech to the cardinals, and I'm just going to read it. He says, "There is one sin which I have come to fear above all others, certainty. If there was only certainty and no doubt, there would be no mystery, and therefore no need for faith. Let us pray that God will grant us a pope who doubts." And that the movie comes back to that idea again and again. And in the final scene, when Dean Lawrence discovers that the man that they have just elected pope is intersex, Cardinal Benitez, I think is his name, and goes to talk to him about it, Cardinal Benitez kind of goes through his story very humbly and then says, I think about the speech you made at the beginning of this conclave, and I'm a person who knows what it means to live between the world certainties, right? And I think that it's kind of a really beautiful illustration of this idea of maintaining faith in God, in your belief system, in your religion, in your church, even when you're not sure how your own experience and life kind of fit into it, right? And I think you could argue there's a political message in this movie about sexuality. I think you could argue that it's trying to make an indictment of the church's dogmas around sexuality. I mean, we can set all those things aside. I think that if you just kind of taking the new critics approach to the text itself of the movie, I think that's a big part of why that revelation is important at the end. I don't know. What did you think? What did you think, Zach?
Yeah, I'm sensitive to woke propaganda, and I didn't read it that way at all. I read it as God's ways are higher than our ways, and that there's always something bigger, a larger vision, and miracles are possible. I think that's how I understood the gender question.
Also, don't you think this cardinal, what was his name again?
Benitez.
Yeah. Benitez. Yeah. Don't you think in the end he represented during the whole movie like this in a very intensely male process, right? Mm-hmm. It turns out these are all men virtually, but there were some women who inserted themselves powerfully at times in the movie, but still, this was a very testosterone infused process here. But Cardinal Benitez was always this like balancing energy there, and there was a masculine quality and a feminine quality to me in the energy that he brought, and it was distinct from the rest of the group, clearly distinct. People were sort of drawn to it, but ultimately, they had a bigger thing going on. Had to choose this pope, and we had to get our agenda, we institutionalized, right? And he did not have that. He did not have an agenda, and he brought like that balance. And so I think it does challenge, notions of patriarchy and put them on display, and says we need a balancing of these energies if we this is what God is calling us to. So that is what God at the end called the church to.
Yeah, the moment that kind of wins him the papacy is, after they learn about the car bomb, that there's been this terrorist attack, one of the leading contenders, who's understood to be a kind of Italian traditionalist, sort of politically right-wing, delivers this kind of tirade about the Catholicism's war with Islam, and we need to stop tolerating them, and we need a leader who understands that we're at war. And it's very kind of aggressive and confrontational and macho. And then Cardinal Benitez stands up and kind of rebukes him, but very quietly, and and rebukes sort of all of them. Says like, "This is my first time here with you, and I've been shocked to see like you're all just small petty men wrestling over power, and that's not what the church is. The church isn't about power or the past or tradition. It's about what we do next, right?" And so one thing that I kept thinking about, I should say up front, like I want to have a certain amount of humility in my analysis of this movie, because watching it as a non-Catholic, I didn't see the things that a lot of Catholic viewers would see. And this film has already prompted a pretty robust conversation and debate about its messages and themes and, inaccuracies or inconsistencies. And you can find a lot out there. In fact, the Atlantic ran a piece by a conservative Catholic writer that calls it even worse than the Da Vinci Code, which you can go check out if you want to kind of see that perspective. But I'm just going to use my own lens here. And the thing that I kept thinking as I was watching this movie, and that I found really compelling, was the comfort that both the characters in the movie have and that presumably a lot of Catholics have with the kind of mingling of the divine with the very flawed and human leadership of their church, right? Like, there is an understanding among Catholics that these conclaves involve a certain amount of politicking and campaigning and compromises and favor trading. Like that just is part of the process. And I think believing Catholics ultimately believe that process is guided by God and that God's will is ultimately done. But there seems to be a certain comfort with the fact that like these are all mortal human men who make mistakes, and that doesn't mean that God isn't present in the process. And I would like, that kind of same realization to migrate over to Mormonism maybe a little bit more. Like, I think intellectually we all understand that the leaders of our church are not perfect, but I think that there's a profound discomfort in ever kind of acknowledging that they sometimes disagree about things. And we've heard leaders of the church talk about the process when the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency are gathered, and how there are disagreements over, what some decision that needs to be made, and that eventually they find their way to a consensus. And I just kept thinking about that while watching Conclave, that like we don't have, if you're a person of faith, that kind of process doesn't have to strike us as grubby or unworthy of godliness, right? That godliness can be in that human process as well. That's what I just kept coming back to while I watched Conclave. I don't know if that theme stuck out to you at all.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what I came away from. I'm also aware that I'm aware of the history of these conclaves in the past. In the 13th, 14th century, when it was a much more bare bones process than it is today. So in a lot of ways, these conclaves have become more amenable to, I think, over the years, to divine influence, when certainly there have been times when right was might within the Catholic hierarchy. So I don't think Catholics come at it from this from a history of some sort of pristine history. I think they recognize that history more than probably more than we do, and we that hasn't been our experience in our church. So I think we probably hold it to a different standard. But
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that there's anywhere near the level of politicking that's portrayed in this movie going on among the leaders of our church.
We haven't had any Medicis and Borgias. And,
yes, right.
So I kept in mind Bishop Robert Barron, for example, was angry about the depiction of the church, and I hadn't read any of the criticism, but I was paying attention to that, like how realistic is this portrayal, and I do think there's a good point that, with the exception of Ray Fiennes and Cardinal Benitez, the other cardinals I think are unworthy of the office of cardinal. I can't imagine anyone rising to the level of cardinal without having greater spiritual depth and wisdom and humility. But I think it's clear that it's a film. It's meant to also be entertaining, and you have to balance realism with entertainment. So I think it's a little bit like Mormons watching that opening scene that's a groaner, and we know that would never happen and is definitely a Hollywood invention. I think John Lithgow and Stanley Tucci, these characters don't strike me as very realistic cardinals, but I think it does portray this mysterious, beautiful process in which God and human interact to try to carry out a divine mission.
The other thing I'll say, I don't know how you guys watch this movie. I rented it on Amazon Prime Video, and on Prime Video they have these little bits of trivia that pop up on the side if you hover over the screen. And the first piece of trivia about the movie that popped up was that just at the studio where this film was shot, this is the third time a Sistine Chapel has been erected at the studio. And that just underscored to me, Catholics have been the subject of movies and TV and books and literature and plays and for so long. and some of it has been really beautiful, and some of it has been really unfair, and a lot of it has been, accurate or inaccurate, and everywhere in between. And I do think there's a maturity among Catholics to a certain extent, at least the Catholics I know, about kind of recognizing that life is a lot long, the life of the church is much longer, and no one movie or TV show or book is going to derail it. And so it's probably best not to get too exercised about any one thing. I think that we can have a tendency to overreact to pop cultural depictions of our people and our faith. I try to balance that with an argument I've long made, which is that we should also try to push back when we think something is truly unfair. But in that spirit, I do want to just read from that review quickly that the Atlantic published by a guy named Matthew Schmitz. He said, no one expects a movie to be a doctrinal treatise, but Conclave's blithe approach to Catholic teachings spoils the drama. The best art about the Catholic Church doesn't necessarily endorse its tenets, but it at least takes them seriously. And then he goes on to say, Conclave is incapable of tapping the dramatic potential of Catholic dogma for the simple reason that the dogma it believes in is not Catholic but progressive. And he basically argues that the cardinals, and this is kind of to your point, Zach, the cardinals depicted, most of them don't seem to have much concern about Catholic teachings. They kind of organize themselves into warring political factions, right? And they're the liberals and they're the conservatives. And probably in reality, if you were to see a conclave like this, there would be factions, but they would be organized more along dogmatic or doctrinal lines and less along political lines that would be familiar at a political convention. And so I do kind of take that point. It didn't spoil the movie for me, but I'm also not Catholic, so
at the same time, I think these dynamics are very real.
Yes.
You had Pope Benedict XVI, a much more conservative theological figure, and then there was a swing to a more reform-minded Pope Francis. And that's been a common feature, I think, of Catholic papal selection, is like trying to balance these forces with discernment.
Thumbs up on Conclave.
I really liked it. I thought it was great. Really well
I
done.
think Matt Schmitz is wrong about what the meaning of the film is. I actually think it is endorsing God's power to guide the church rather than this being about progressive ideas winning out.
Well, and I would also say that this comes on the heels of, or not necessarily on the heels, but the last several years, we've seen a few depictions of the Vatican that all share this tendency. So HBO had a show called The New Pope a number of years ago. Jude Law, or no, it was called The Young Pope. Jude Law plays this like young American pope who comes into power. He's actually very right-wing, reactionary almost in his politics, but then you end up kind of seeing him transform and evolve. Then there was another season of that show that was called The New Pope, where you see another pope come into power. There's also a film a few years ago called The Two Popes, which has kind of an imagined conversation between Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. That's super interesting. What's interesting about all those depictions, and I think you can put Conclave in there, is that all of them, to varying degrees, effectively endorse the divinity of the Catholic Church. Like they endorse God's place in the Catholic Church. In the two HBO series, you see actual miracles take place. In the Two Popes, I believe they take pretty seriously the idea of the presence of the Holy Spirit, and the fictional version of Pope Benedict believes that the Spirit is withdrawn from him and that's why he can no longer lead. It's certainly in Conclave, you see a number of instances where there's divine intervention to steer the ultimate outcome of the conclave. And so, yeah, I mean, if I'm a Catholic watching this, I certainly understand the frustrations with inaccuracies and maybe the injection of a brand of politics that you find objectionable. But the fact that all of these depictions basically treat the Catholic Church as God's church on earth, I think, that's a win. And again, to your point, not to just keep coming back to it, but to your point, I don't know if we would see those same depictions 20 years ago, when New Atheism was sort of on the rise, ascendant in American culture and intelligentsia.
I also see a new appreciation for tradition and ritual. We live in an era where that's been almost eliminated from society, and I think people are like looking at it now and with new eyes. There's something else that occurs to me. We're at the end of a very secular age here, and we may be hitting some sort of a tipping point, looking at it sort of optimistically from a religious point of view. But used to thinking that institutions, religions, there's been a predominant discussion where it's all corrupt, and it's like we don't need these institutions anymore. And I remember, was it Laurel Thatcher? I think it was Laurel Thatcher Ulrich. Someone came to her once and said, I've just come to the conclusion that our religion is 90% man and 10% divine, or something like that. And she said, wait, 10%? If you can find 10% divine, hold on to that with all you have. It's almost like we're at that point where after so much deconstruction, we're ready to actually recognize and give space for when the divine enters, and appreciate that for the miracle that it is. So I think that I see that in Conclave. I kind of see that in a way in Heretic. And so, yeah, for that reason, I consider them both pro-faith, not in any unnuanced way at all, but ultimately pro-faith and pro-religion.
Yeah, and I think there's one more dynamic at play, which is why we're seeing this shift in how religion is being depicted in Hollywood. And that is that for a long time, religion for people who came of age in the 60s and 70s was culturally powerful. And there was a kind of rebellious frisson in taking down the man represented by institutional religion. And as religious affiliation has declined in the last decades, it is impossible to believe that religion is powerful in that same way. And so I think it's giving a new generation of filmmakers freedom to approach them in a different way. They're seen as, it's seen as acceptable to take their ideas seriously because you're not supporting oppression.
That's really interesting. Like, no Hollywood filmmaker wants to see itself as like a mouthpiece of institutional power, and certainly not oppressive power in the culture. But if we have gotten to a point where religion is so marginalized in the culture that it can be seen as almost kind of a curious like minority to be explored, it opens up all kinds of interesting creative possibilities in Hollywood. And
Yeah.
I love that. I think that I've found myself that even just in my little area of the culture, which is primarily media and journalism, there's a lot more curiosity about faith, and to the point where my editors are constantly asking me to write about religion, and not just my own, but certainly my own as well. And I actually have to kind of remind them that I also, write about politics and national affairs, and there's some stuff going on there too. But there is kind of this like curiosity, hunger, appetite for, understanding faith and religion and the cultures and peoples that they've created. And I think it's really exciting.
And one follow-on to that dynamic, which is Ross Douthat in 2016, he proclaimed a very prophetic tweet. He said, "A thought sent back in time to the theocracy panic of 2005. If you dislike the religious right, wait till you meet the post-religious right." And I think we're seeing a mature grappling with the important role of religion in trying to direct and harness male energy. And an Andrew Tate form of male energy is much worse than a Catholic or Mormon patriarchy in I think any reasonable evaluation. And so I think that's one other reason why ideas of gender and patriarchy are being revisited.
Yeah, that's right. Should we give Ross the last word here? And maybe invite him into our next movie show. And
his prophetic tweets. I just want one tweet of mine ever in the thousands that I have written, wasting time on Twitter, to be called prophetic. But I think we can end with his prophetic tweet. That's fair.
Well, thank you, McKay and Bill, for joining today, this conversation. Let's do this again.
Thank you.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Zach Davis, Bill Turnbull, and McKay Coppins. We would love to hear from you. You can email us at info@faithmatters.org or leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. We read all of the reviews, and it really helps us to get the word out about Faith Matters, and we appreciate the support. Thanks again for listening, and remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.